Zelensky Bad News On extremism charges, Russia locks up a Navalny supporter. On Monday, a supporter of Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny was given a 9-year prison sentence for participating in an extremist organization, as reported by Navalny's team on Telegram. In December of 2021, Vadim Ostanin, head of Navalny's office in the Siberian city of Barnaul, was arrested. In addition, he was accused of being a part of a group that infringes on citizens' rights. The team working for Navalny claims that Ostanin engaged in legal political work. The conviction of Ostanin is part of a larger effort in Russia to silence political dissent. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has only made this worse. Navalny is a vocal opponent of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. After spending time in Germany recovering from nerve agent poisoning, which he blamed on the Kremlin, he returned to Russia in January 2021, where he was promptly apprehended. Putin's political opponents in Russia face harsh repercussions. Many of Navalny's political allies have been arrested or forced into exile as Russian authorities continue to target Putin's critics. In 2021, Moscow would outright ban Navalny's political parties. More than 7 years in prison was recently handed down to Lilia Chanishova, another Navalny supporter from Ufa in central Russia. The cramped, filthy prison cell that Ostanin described as 6 square meters in a basement with a window covered with debris, that regularly flooded and was infested with rats and spiders. Navalny has been arrested on multiple charges, including fraud and contempt of court, and is currently being held in a maximum security prison outside of Moscow. Prosecutors have been pushing for an extended 20-year sentence on extremism charges since last week. The charges against Navalny and the lengthy prison terms he faces, he says, are an effort to stifle political dissent in Russia. The legal team for opposition politician Alexei Navalny released a statement on Thursday in which he said, "Anyone in Russia knows that a person who seeks justice in a court of law is completely vulnerable. That person's situation is hopeless." For the 2019 summit between Russia and Africa, 43 African heads of state showed up. They expected Russia to become an important trading partner and investor on the continent. Russian President Vladimir Putin has pledged to increase his country's $40 billion in annual trade with Africa by 2020. Since then, $14 billion has been shaved off of Russia's trade with the continent. Russia's exports to Africa are 7 times higher than imports from Africa to Russia. The trade between Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, and South Africa accounts for 70% of the total. Russia's investments in Africa are minimal at best. It's responsible for 1% of all FDI into the continent. Foreign direct investment in Africa comes primarily from Mauritius. Russia's GDP has also declined, from $2.3 trillion in 2013 to an estimated $1.8 trillion in 2021. Russia's influence in Africa has grown rapidly since 2019, despite weakening economic ties. It has sent troops to the continent and is now the most important foreign ally for some nations. At least 16 African countries have been targets of Russian disinformation campaigns. Most of this progress has been made through illegal means. Wagner paramilitary forces, electoral interference, disinformation, and arms for resources deals are all used to prop up secluded, autocratic regimes. These strategies are all very unsettling for the host nation. As might be expected, Russia's influence peddling in Africa has resulted in war in half of the continent's 24 countries. In other African countries where Russia is vying for influence, Russia has similarly undermined UN operations, heightening insecurity. About the same number of African heads of state are expected to attend this year's St. Petersburg summit as in 2019. Despite Russia's increasingly aggressive policies on the continent and internationally. Russian and African elites hope to gain political and financial benefits from the deals, which are more consequential than the deals themselves. Having followed Russia's disruptive interventions in Africa for a long time, I can say that ordinary citizens will be the ones to pay for these exclusive partnerships through increased taxes, heightened instability, and diminished freedom. There is no doubt that Russia will benefit from the Russia-Africa summit. It suggests things are back to normal after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war crimes arrest warrant issued against Putin by the International Criminal Court, and the failed uprising led by Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin. Although trade between the two continents is limited, Africa gives Russia a global platform from which it can strut its geostrategic stuff. To Russia, Africa is more important than Africa is to Russia. Moscow's potential benefits. Why African leaders would even consider attending the St. Petersburg summit is beyond comprehension, given Russia's history of destabilization on the continent since 2019. Every single African country where Wagner has been stationed has experienced a decline in security and an increase in human rights violations. Communities in areas where Wagner has been granted mining access have been forced to abandon their homes out of fear of reprisals. To curry favor with these autocratic governments, Moscow shields them from international sanctions for crimes against humanity and other violations of democratic norms. Russia's involvement in Africa correlates with lower levels of democracy, with the region's median score being 19. Freedom House reports that the average level of democracy in Africa is 51 out of 100. Russia can show that business is normal at the summit. And African leaders have given Russia an implicit green light to break international law, so it is not a pariah. This year's summit will be used to divert attention from Russia's responsibility for causing the disruption in global grain supplies by claiming falsely that Western sanctions are limiting the export of Russian, and Ukrainian, food and fertilizer to Africa. The summit also demonstrates Africa's growing significance in Russian foreign policy. Russia continues to find the most open arms in Africa. It also refuses to condemn Moscow for its invasion of Ukraine. Since Russia attacked in March 2022, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has made at least 8 trips to Africa. Possible drawbacks for Africa: lackluster investment, normalizing autocracy, sowing instability, and interfering in Africa's internal politics don't bode well for a productive relationship. It's understandable to take a neutral stance on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which may seem far away. But why would African leaders keep talking to a foreign actor that has a track record of making the continent less stable? An honest evaluation of national interests doesn't make much of an argument. Russia's irregular tactics are causing sovereignty crises across the continent and threaten to spread further. Meanwhile, the continent's emerging credibility as a safe haven for investment and international partnerships is being harmed by the breakdown of the rule of law. Russia's influence operations almost always aim to aid entrenched, usually autocratic, regimes in maintaining their hold on power. Packages often include shady mining and arms deals. African leaders who stand to gain from these strategies have welcomed overtures from Moscow. Some African leaders may be trying to gain Western support by currying favor with Russia. Some may mistakenly believe that they have a chance to attract more Russian investment or inspire more positive Russian engagement by taking part. Everyone attending the summit will be able to use the expected announcements of mining, energy, grain, transportation, and digitalization deals as a convenient smokescreen. Even if those strategies don't pan out. Sobering up, Russia's strategy of elite co-option is, in reality, increasing the chasm between the interests of African leaders and their people. Citizens frequently express a desire for greater democracy, job creation, and adherence to the rule of law. All three are being weakened by Russia's continental engagements. Another takeaway from the summit is that most African political leaders will not champion reforms on citizen priorities for better governance, development, and security because of the interests gap between them and the citizens. African civil society, media, and independent judiciaries will need to take the lead on these interests. Russian President Vladimir Putin will use this year's conference in St. Petersburg to portray Russia and Africa as having common goals. Whose interests are being served is the central question for people in Africa.